Welcome to the Disasters and Donuts podcast, where you can learn about robots from disasters and the time it takes to eat a donut and have a cup of coffee. I'm Robin Murphy, and let's talk about drone safety. Drone safety conjures things like safety operations in manned airspace, using drones for public safety. Both are important, but if you are using or even just thinking about using drones for emergency response, there are two aspects of safety that often get overlooked. Personal safety. Three different categories of personal safety, one of which is, what about your safety under extreme conditions? When you're working long distances, 20 miles or more away from the emergency operations center, and there's no one to help you, there's no Taco Bell or 7-Eleven that's open to grab some food and water. So when you think about going out to the field, even working directly for an agency, you have to be worried about being self-sufficient for 72 hours. You have to have the right type of clothing. None of this show up with flip-flops, which I've had people volunteer and show up and do. What about your first aid kit? Have you taken a wilderness first aid course? And you always need to have a buddy. You're going to need them as your visual observer anyway, but you need to have a buddy. The second category is personal safety under fatigue. Recent studies by my colleagues at Texas A&M have shown that after just one day in the field, the pilots of small unmanned aerial systems are showing fatigue at the same level of blood alcohol that would be prohibited to fly a civilian aircraft. So it's pretty high. And they also offer ways to mitigate this. And we have another podcast on fatigue and the practical ways to mitigate. But keep in mind, you're going to be very tired and fatigued. What about personal safety from other people? Okay, we strongly recommend that if you're not embedded with an agency, you're in an agency truck working with agency responders, then you should have clothing, your vehicle, something. Everything should clearly identify you and your team as part of the agency. And that helps the locals realize that you're not just a looky-loo that's trying to take pictures and just callously not thinking about their suffering. Or a news crew. I can't tell you how many times I have been assumed that I was a producer for something like CNN because, I'm a woman. You also want to keep in mind the applicable regulations for trespassing. There are many cases in which an agency does not have right of entry onto people's property, even if it is an emergency. So that's very common in wilderness search and rescue applications. After a certain period of time, the police just can't go anywhere without special permission. So think about that, what that means in terms of flying your UAV, where you're standing, where you're deploying, if it's going to land, where's it going to land? Is it going to land on somebody else's property? But you also need to think about dangerous situations. Well, certainly had people who've been annoyed, like, why are you here? And then, oh, you're with this county, that's great, that's wonderful use. But what about truly dangerous situations? And we encountered that when we were called in to assist during Hurricane Katrina at New Orleans. And by the time on day 2 that we got there at New Orleans, it was so clear that things had fallen apart so badly. And there we are with SUVs full of gas cans and shiny equipment, that this was going to be very dangerous, that we were ripe for having been carjacked, and we just turned around and fell back to assist Florida, who was assisting Mississippi. Let's talk about safety of the drone itself. I'm thinking things like landing zones. I mean, remember, when you're flying in a disaster, you no longer get to pick optimal landing zones for taking off and landing. They may be flooded. There may only be easements with power lines or fences. Very little space to work off of. Again, we've already talked a little bit about your emergency landing zones. They may be water, they may be not physically accessible, they may be on private property. Another thing to think about is batteries, your battery storage. Are you going to be in a hot car and is it going to be freezing cold? Do you check that your batteries are going bad? And this is another thing. Are you skipping the physical inspection of your drone? And what about checklist? You know, when we fly under regular conditions, it's so easy to get used to not really doing some of that. But remember, anything that isn't a habit or routine under good conditions will definitely fall by the wayside if you're fatigued. So remember, the goal is to deploy drones safely in all senses of the word so that it helps, not distracts or interferes with disaster management and public safety. I hope this is of use to you, and please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel and visit our website at crazor.org.